Good evening, everyone. My name is Lucia Lohman, and I'm the Executive Director of the ATBC. It's my true pleasure to welcome you tonight for this very special event co-hosted by the ATBC and OTS to celebrate the International Day of the Tropics. Our guest of honor tonight is Dr. Peter Raven, President Emeritus of the Missouri Botanical Garden, and also a longtime friend and collaborator of both the ATBC and OTS. Before we conduct a formal introduction of Dr. Raven, I would like to invite Beth Breaker, CEO of OTS, to say a few welcoming words.
Welcome, everyone. We're so happy to be joining with the ATBC again this year to celebrate the International Day of the Tropics. And we're so pleased to have Dr. Peter Raven join us today. I'd like to just let you know about this series of talks, TropTalks. This is the fourth one. The third one was also in collaboration with the ATBC, and we hope to hold many more of these events. And if you'd like to hear more, please email James Boyle, whose contact information will come up in the chat. With that, I'd like to pass the floor to Dr. Muriel Poston, who will be introducing Dr. Raven. Dr. Poston is a professor of environmental analysis at Pitzer College. She is on the board of Organization for Tropical Studies, and she is an accomplished botanist and has a personal connection to our speaker tonight. Muriel.
Thank you so much, Beth. Peter Raven has been an active botanist since his early membership as a teenager with the California Academy of Sciences before he matriculated to UC Berkeley as an undergraduate and continued his graduate education at UCLA as a student of Harlan Lewis. He and Harlan Lewis published a seminal study on Clarkia, which, as mythology has it, began with Peter's collection of a new species of Clarkia at age 14 from in front of the California Academy of Sciences. His first academic appointment was at Stanford University, and it was there that I was fortunate enough to take his class on the evolution of flowering plants, to have him as my undergraduate advisor, and he has had a tremendous impact on my interest in botany and my career. Peter began his long tenure at the Missouri Botanical Garden in the 1970s and retired to the position of President Emeritus of MBG after 4 decades. Peter has published extensively in systematics and evolutionary biology, as well as biogeography of plants, in addition to 2 pivotal textbooks, Biology of Plants and Environment, both of which I have used in my teaching. Peter is a past president of OTS, received the ATBC Honorary Fellow Award in 2000, is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, is a member of the board of the National Geographic Society, received the U.S. National Medal of Science, a MacArthur Fellowship, the International Prize for Biology from the Japanese government, and serves on the Academies of Science from Argentina, Brazil, China, Denmark, India, Italy, Mexico, Russia, Sweden, and the UK, in addition to several other countries. It is with great pleasure that I welcome Dr. Raven to help us honor the International Day of the Tropics with his talk on tropical studies in the face of disaster. Peter, the floor is yours.
Well, what a pleasure it is to be able to be here with you this evening. It has been a long time since I first became interested in the tropics, and there have been great changes during that time. And I thought maybe if I gave a little chronology, you would understand why I've been so impacted by it and why I've chosen some of the life decisions that I've made along the way. My first trip to the tropics was in 1959, which was in the last year of my graduate studies at UCLA, and there was a student exchange to the country of Colombia. And at that time, I can remember, for example, in my 2 months in Colombia, taking the long road from Cali to Bucaramanga in the middle of the night and watching the uninterrupted tropical rainforest and the fireflies, several different kinds of fireflies zooming through the air, around the edges of our bus. I mean, what a treat that was. I'm sorry to say that if you were to take that same route today, you would find cleared fields and people, not much else. The forest is entirely gone. And we are rapidly eating into the forest in northwestern South America, where that took place, which is some of the richest forest to be found anywhere in the world. Why is it gone? Well, when I made that visit to Colombia in 1959, the world population was 3 billion people, 3 billion. And what's the world population now in 2022? It's 8 billion people. In other words, the population of the world has well more than doubled, nearly tripled during the time since I first visited the tropics. Small wonder then that we would be encountering real difficulties in conservation there and in sustainability. As time went by, while I was at Stanford, I not only had the pleasure of working with Muriel in the 1960s, but I taught in my first course on OTS in 1967. And Gary Hartshorn can remember, who was a student in that course, can remember me giving a lecture then on spaceship Earth, basically, and what was happening to it. That was about as close as we got to worrying about the world in those days, realizing that we were on a single finite planet. Adlai Stevenson and others had stimulated us to think in that way, and we were wondering how we might be able to deal with it. It really was not evident in 1967 either that tropical forests were disappearing rapidly, at least it wasn't evident to most of us, or for that matter, that a large number of species were becoming extinct very rapidly. It wasn't until a couple of years later, that Norman Myers, who was an Oxford biologist out working at the British Foreign Service in Kenya, circulated a letter in which he asked people whether they had noticed massive extinctions of species in their individual areas. That was in 1969. He found indeed that a few people were, although he got very few answers to his letter because it was kind of, where's this weird question coming from? How many species, vast numbers becoming extinct? It doesn't seem to make sense at all. However, sadly, it turned out that it did make sense. In 1971, I transferred to the Missouri Botanical Garden and soon after began chairing a NSF-sponsored committee on research priorities in systematic and evolutionary biology. And chairing that very distinguished committee, we came up with a list of priorities, and among those priorities were study of the tropics, because we had a feeling that the tropics were in trouble, and we knew that more species were there. One of the surprising discoveries that, for me at least, that we made during the course of that study was, in the early 70s, it used to be estimated that other than bacteria, there were about 1.5 million species of organisms in the world, 500,000 of which were tropical and 1 million of which were temperate. That was all very well and good until one stopped to think that twice as many species were found in the tropics in well-known groups as were found in temperate regions. And if that were the case, then there ought to be at least 3 or 4 million species, with many more of them unknown than we had suspected in the early 70s. By the end of the 70s, Bill Sievers, who was then at NSF, said, well, if we're supposed to do all this work in the tropics, what should we do? I mean, give us some guidance. He said, will you put together a committee to find out or to emphasize research priorities in tropical biology? And that we did in the late 70s. But tellingly, one of the things that wasn't so clear at that time or when we began was just what was happening to tropical forests. And since I knew Norman Myers was very well positioned to work with this, our committee hired him to do a worldwide inventory of tropical forests. Satellite imagery wasn't available in those days in the ways that it came to be much later. And the only way that Norman could really form a decent estimate of how fast tropical forest was going was to visit various tropical countries, go out into the field, talk to people, talk to the government, and see what was happening. And what he found was truly hair-raising, because he found for the first time that tropical forests were indeed really beginning to vanish very rapidly indeed with the swelling human population. That done, there began to be a great deal more worry about what was going on and what to do about it. In the late, that was 79 when he first looked into it. At about that same time, Tom Lovejoy first coined the term biological diversity, by which he meant the set of species present at an individual locality. And a few years later, in connection with a symposium held at the National Academy of Sciences, Ed Wilson and the staff of the symposium coined the term biodiversity. Biodiversity soon became a much wider term because it was taken to mean not only the number of species present at a locality or in Earth, but it came to mean all the relationships between them, all of their ecology, and everything else that we could find out about them. What kinds of recommendations did we make for biologists in view of the very rapidly disappearing tropical forests that we saw evident at that time? Well, one was to complete the inventory of groups of organisms that were well enough known for that inventory to make a difference. And in other words, they had to be fairly well known to begin with, because we were, after all, running out of time. And so that would include vertebrates, most of the groups of vertebrates, butterflies, plants, and the like. That, of course, was being done in museums at the time, and it carried on. We also said that for other groups like fungi, nematodes, and mites, which were almost entirely unknown, that we needed to find ways of systematically trying to determine their diversity by setting up kind of worldwide schemes or individual posts or places to look, and estimating the numbers there and then trying to extrapolate from them. At present, we don't even really know whether there are more species of nematodes in the tropics than there are in temperate regions, which is kind of strange. But we do know that there are well over 1 million species of nematodes, with only a few 100,000 actually named. The worst lack probably is fungi, which have an estimated, people who've worked on it recently have estimated maybe 2.3, 2.5 million species. About 100,000 species of fungi have been named. The other more than 2 million are unnamed. And yet there is no group of organisms of more economic or ecological importance than the fungi. There are very few people studying them, and there's really very little that we know about them. And as we'll see, the forests are going so rapidly that it's unlikely that we will know about many of them before they're gone permanently. For groups like that, our committee set out the idea that we ought to, I said, set up some kind of international networks where we could sample them along the way. Another recommendation we made very strongly, which unfortunately has never really been taken up, was that we ought to look in detail at all of the interactions between the organisms found at individual places in the tropics, and where had people worked a lot that they could feasibly do that. Well, one would be La Selva. Another would be in the central Amazon, probably. Another would be Barrow, Colorado Island in the canal zone where the Smithsonian had a long history. And another would be the Royal Society's study station in Borneo. And what we hoped was that people would take up the detailed study of those places, and in doing so, would discover ecological principles that would be suitable or would work in helping to understand all the rest of the tropics. It's important to remember, I mean, we think of ecology as an established science, but when I was at Stanford, when Muriel and I were in Stanford in the 1960s, ecology was virtually a laughingstock. And in fact, molecular biology, which had just begun opening up in the 1950s, and for which the 60s were the golden age, had taken everything over. And the molecular biologists tended to scoff at the rest of us and say, what you're doing is just fairy tales. And I remember we tried to hire Hal Mooney. We were trying to hire Hal Mooney during the latter half of the 60s, who had made the mistake of going to another university. We needed him, and we knew that, but the molecular biologists on the staff and other people sort of laughed at the idea that Stanford, with its distinguished Department of Biological Sciences, would be hiring an ecologist. And one of the things, Hal studied an alpine plant called Oxyria digena in terms of its genetic variability. And in doing that, he was flown by the Navy at one point from one peak in the White Mountains in California to another. And I can still remember Charlie Yanofsky saying, no real scientist would ever be flown around in a helicopter trying to do research. It's just crazy. You have to get down to basic facts. And if you understand basic facts, then everything else becomes clear to you. At any rate, we did succeed in hiring Hal, who of course has become one of the most distinguished scientists on the globe in ecology, but ecology has really just opened up during that period. And the fact of the matter is, we not only don't know a great deal about interactions in these large and species complex communities in the tropics, we don't know, we equally don't know much about the areas in temperate regions that we've studied. NSF's program on individual sites in temperate regions, which has more than a couple of dozen sites in the United States, for example, has opened up a lot of realities about the relationships between organisms in those sites. But there's not one of them where a great deal more study couldn't be done, and very, very profitably. Now a word about OTS. OTS was founded in the early 1960s by people who were worried about getting university students in the United States exposure to the tropics. Mildred Mathias and Reed Rollins and Steve Bechtel and so forth of the University of Washington. And it was formed then and began to have students. Dan Jansen was active in the earliest years of OTS. And as I said, I taught there in 1967. We were talking about spaceships and things, as I said, but we knew that the Earth was finite. But until Norman Mars came along, we really didn't realize that the tropics were also going rapidly. Many, many distinguished OTS courses, dozens and dozens and dozens of them went forward. And most ecologists in the United States, and ecology from the 1970s onward, from the 1960s onward, was gaining steam. It was almost considered de rigueur for any ecologist to go to OTS to get some kind of an exposure to the tropics, and that was a very good thing. Now, what about Costa Rica? Well, one page of my notes has drifted away. However, knowing all the facts, I can go on anyway. Costa Rica was, when OTS started, very largely forested, but actually, even with the efficient preservation of national parks in Costa Rica, it was taken down to from 75% forest cover to about 15% over the next years, 15. And in fact, when the parks were being set aside in Costa Rica, it was one of the most rapidly logged places in the world, being more rapidly logged outside of the parks. In 1981, the Costa Ricans passed laws crediting people with tax relief for leaving the forests alone. And in doing that, they built a country that's now became a center for tourism. So that while the Global Footprint Network, which estimates degrees of use of natural productivity based on United Nations statistics, was reaching its conclusions, it estimates that even now Costa Rica imports 63% more than it produces naturally internally. Now, Costa Rica, though, has the good fortune to have fallen onto tourism, and in falling onto tourism has created a source of income to keep things going without smashing at the forest the way that the Brazilians are for soy or the Indonesians are for oil palms or other destruction of tropics in the world. And Costa Rica is now largely settled with good forests, lots of tourism. One doesn't really know whether the regrown forests have as many species as the original ones, but they're extremely rich. Worldwide, though, the picture is very somber. Global Footprint Network estimates that we are using 175% of what the world can produce on an ongoing basis, which means that Earth Overshoot Day, as they nominate it, which occurs in early July, is a time when we've used up all of the natural productivity for that year in the world. When you put that together with the fact that wealthy nations in the world, like the United States, Western Europe, Japan, Australia, with something like 12 to 14% of the global population use over 40% of the world's productivity, you can understand how it is that most nations in the world are pushed into a very bad corner when it comes to natural productivity and have little option but to take everything that they can from their natural forests. In Haiti, about a decade ago, the last natural tree was cut down. In Madagascar, we seem to one of the richest and most interesting places in the world. We have only a tiny fraction of original forest left. And with the population scheduled, the human population scheduled to grow from its current 8 billion people to 10 billion by the middle of the century, 30 years from now. In other words, in the next 30 years, it'll grow by almost as many as were around when I made my first trip to the tropics. Most scientists see little hope for any tropical forest still remaining there at the end of the century. What can we do about it? Well, in an age of massive extinction, we can redouble our efforts along the lines that were laid out by our tropical priorities study in the late 1970s, which is we can redouble our efforts on the well-known groups. We can form partnerships to work together on them. We can find effective ways of sampling the lesser known groups at individual sites. We can redouble our efforts at individual places like La Selva to try to understand all of the interactions that are taking place there. In a more general sense, of course, what we need to do is much bigger. It will include not only an individual determination to live as conservatively as possible in terms of consuming what the world produces, but it will require much broader national points of view to begin to achieve those aims. One thing that we really need to do is to bring the population back into line. If 8 billion people are consuming everything that the world produces in half a year, you can see why people who've tried to wrestle with the problem of how many people can the world accommodate have come to the conclusion that it would be like 2 or 3 billion on an ongoing basis. It's amazing to me to think that when I first went to the tropics and I was in my 20s, there were as many people in the whole world as the world could tolerate. But the 5 billion to 7 billion to maybe 10 billion more that are being added cannot be tolerated. In order to do that, we'll have to find gentle but persuasive ways that go worldwide. One of the things that we need to do most urgently will be to recognize worldwide, very carefully and systematically, the rights of women. About 1 billion women and children have no rights whatever in the world. And although women by no means achieve the recognition or the opportunities that they should have in the United States, the situation for about 1 billion other women around the world is completely beyond the pale. And the problem with that is it's a double problem, because not only does it have a direct bearing on reproduction, it has a direct bearing on how many brains there are to help us out of this dilemma. In the United States, I think more than half of the ecology students in graduate school in the United States now are probably women. But worldwide, there are many women who have no chance at all to express themselves in any place, whatever. In doing that, we'll have to, and finally, we'll have to find ways to overcome our greed. The United States, if people lived at the level that we do in the United States, it would require the equivalent of about 4 to 5 copies of the planet Earth to support them on an ongoing basis. And you can see that there are like 330 million people in the United States, and there are 8 billion people in the world, and yet the amount that we're using amounts to 4 to 5 times the capacity of the planet per year. Where are we getting it? We're scrounging it up from nations all over the world. And when nations have been stressed far enough, they fall into what Mathis Wackernagel with his global footprint network have called an ecological poverty hole, where all they can do is sell what they can produce by scraping it out of their forests, and by doing that, import the basic necessities for their lives. We are ready to fight up to a degree for nations like Ukraine, but the question then comes directly to us: are we willing to fight for nations like Burkina Faso or Upper Volta? And I think you all know the answer to that, or Indonesia, or any such nations that are not exactly like us. No, we want to compete with them, and on our matter of greed, to concentrate as much wealth as we can in our own countries. We will have to overcome that greed through knowledge, through traveling around the world, through international organizations like the 2 represented here. We'll have to learn to meet people all over the world and to recognize people all over the world. It's a terrible scrape in the United States to get anywhere near where we ought to be in interracial recognition, but worldwide, for the most part, we haven't even begun. And we must begin if we want to save this precious planet with anything like the beautiful load of biodiversity and nature and wonder that it has on it now, and that are running the planet on a timely basis and in effect for our good. In other words, send your children around the world, learn about other places, visit other places, work in other places, understand how it is to live in other places. And I mean for the United States as well as other countries around the world, and realize that we share a common humanity. Learn to love that common humanity, teach your children to love it, keep loving it, keep working on it, and there will be a hope for a world which, although deprived and depleted ecologically, will still contain many of the awesome and wonderful sights and experiences that we have had during our own lifetimes. We owe it to the future. We must give it to the future. We must learn to do it for the sake of everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Raven. Peter, that was wonderful, and particularly ending on the theme of love, not only amongst humanity, but for the planet itself. I'm going to take a point of privilege and ask one of the first questions, if that's acceptable. And this one actually came from Janet Franklin. And that's, she would like to know what the research priorities might be for saving the tropics at this point in time. Or should our focus be on training or on communication and conservation policy? Would you be able to help us think about that?
Yeah, there's no research that we can do that will save the tropics, but the same Norman Myers who found how fast the tropics were going developed the idea of hotspots, which are areas in the world that he defined originally as having more than 2,000 endemic species of plants found nowhere else, and had been at least 70% occupied by people. Now, what we're going to need to do in part, if we can save any of it, is to do it in a very intelligent way, like Stuart Pym, for example, with his Saving Earth organization is doing it, and find the most critical bridges between pieces of vegetation that are left to allow migration and to enlarge the ranges of plants and animals by affording them room, space around them. Identifying hotspots, identifying rich regions, trying to keep those is one thing we can do. Another thing we can do to learn, although nobody knows how this can be applied yet to conservation, is try the kind of thing that Dan Jansen, always imaginative, beyond most of us, is learning to do, is doing in Costa Rica, or attempting to do in Costa Rica. And that's to get genomic sequences for as many of the organisms in Costa Rica as possible. There are undoubtedly millions of species of plants, animals, and microorganisms in Costa Rica, and gaining those couple of million genomes, hundreds of thousands of genomes, is going to be very difficult. But we can expect them, partly by the duplication that occurs in genome after genome, we can expect them to reveal a great deal of the nature of life on Earth, and possibly therefore to help us with conservation. The main things we can do with conservation, though, as I've recited at the end of my talk, is not so much to do research, although the more we know, the better we can do, but to get with one another as nations and as people, share the wealth, use the wealth to preserve a little bit of the world while we can, easily preserve groups like plants that can be put away, seeds can be put away in seed banks, get on doing what we can while we're gaining a kind of a world appreciation that will serve us to mount new plans as the 23rd century rolls along. And that's about my comment on that question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And I want to join Muriel in thanking you so much for this really, really inspiring presentation. And I want to also take this opportunity to ask another question that was placed in the chat, which is from someone who didn't identify themselves, but it says that they were really interested in the portion of your talk when you talked about the involvement of females in tropical ecology research and science. And this person is asking, so on your thoughts on what is the way forward to increase the involvement of women, and what would be, how significant would be that?
I've already indicated, I think, the significance, which you can put at the simplest possible level. If we keep people from contributing what they can contribute, it doesn't matter whether they're women or lesbians or men or dwarfs, it doesn't matter what they are. If we rule out their brains and we don't let them contribute what they can, we lose a lot. No one knows what the individual brains might be capable of. In dealing with countries around the world, and we have plenty to work on in the United States, which we are working on step by step, around the world, what we have to do is simply say we won't stand for it and encourage nations all around the world to recognize women and include them in their own affairs to an appropriate degree. They're losing far more than they realize by not doing that, and we're only helping them in that way. I've always thought that if people, male or female, like to or prefer to take time out to raise kids, and that could be male or female, raise a family, one of the most important things we can do in the United States is to set up courses specially made to bring them back up to date in their fields and to break them back into laboratory work once they finish with that, because that will normally occupy something like 15 years in a person's life. And as I say, male or female. My only son, for example, is a stay-at-home dad, and his wife is a member of the staff at the EPD. If we do that, we'll get much more brain power freed up too. If not, we tend to leave people kind of stranded, especially women. Falls on raised family and get stranded, no way back in. Big loss, not only lose the brain, but lose the training. Let's be creative, and let's remember the ultimate absolute necessity and importance of having us all work together on this mammoth problem that we're confronting.
Thank you.
Peter, I'd like to follow up on another question that was asked. This one was asked of you by Gary Hartshorn. He was interested in whether you had some other organizations in mind, particularly in Asia and Africa, that had been important in the past or might be important in the future in training the next generation of field scientists. And I'd like to expand on that and ask you to also perhaps comment on how existing organizations could best network to provide those kind of global connections that you referred to in your talk.
Well, of course, the first example that comes to mind is OTS efforts in South Africa, spurred on by Bill Robertson and then of the Mellon Foundation, where OTS has made a huge difference in training people and bringing them into the fold in South Africa, which basically is much better equipped with scientists than it could be in any way otherwise. Nations, organizations rather, like the Nature Conservancy and the Worldwide Fund for Nature do work with people all over the world, but as far as I'm concerned, they don't work hard enough with training people in countries all over the world to take positions of authority in promoting conservation. At the Missouri Botanical Garden, every time we started a program in a new country, I insisted that people actually live there and work with the people there, because by doing so, they could bring that country up to a level where it could do something for itself, even if it was short on resources. And by not doing so, it would be just like sort of a predatory voyage, gathering information for the developed world. So I think any organization that works at all in tropical countries, in developing countries, in other countries other than itself, ought to think very hard about training and do whatever it could to put in place OTS-like or university-like or whatever kinds of organizations would be best suited to train people who could work well within the organizational possibilities of that individual country.
Thank you.
If I might follow up on a question, you raised the difference in our support globally for Ukraine versus other parts of the world, and particularly with respect to the tropics. It does resonate as an environmental justice issue, if nothing else, similar to the challenges we have nationally. with the impact of environmental justice being differential amongst communities. Do you have particular recommendations of policy positions that would be helpful in moving our perception and support for the preservation, or at least using your hotspot model for a tropical forest, either in Africa or Indonesia or other places that are particularly in need of preservation?
The big problem is in the industrialized countries of the world, we've got to learn to live at a lower standard of consumption than we are now because we've got to free up cash. Greed will always keep concentrating cash in the wealthy countries of the world and dumping a little money on tropical countries. And I mean, that's what I found out in the course of my career and working in different, dumping a little money for them to form parks and say, if we give you this money, will you put aside a park, like say Kenya? Then that ignores the fact that people are starving all over the country. And I guess a really good example of that would be Madagascar, where there are plenty of parks, but mostly poor people, many malnourished, many dying of starvation every time a famine comes along, and yet one of the real hotspots of biodiversity in the world. So developing an international point of view in the United States and all over the world, developing a one planet point of view, developing a situation where we realize that we all are running this single planet, what Carl Sagan called memorably the faint blue spot. Running that is all of our obligation, and the rich people in the world can't do that by running the poor ones into the ditch. Oxfam has calculated that about 8 people in the world that's a British charity, own about as much as 4.6 billion people in the world, more than half the people in the world. And when you come to that, and when you have people mounting useless trips of their own to the stars and all, when there are all these hundreds of thousands of people starving on Earth, you kind of have to begin to realize that things are not equitable. Teaching an international viewpoint would be the biggest thing we could do there. Getting to understand other countries, getting to understand the value, getting to understand the beauty of their civilizations, getting to understand the fact that we achieve victories and we achieve broad conceptions through the amalgamation of a wide range of thoughts of people all over the world with different backgrounds. That kind of thing would be the beginning, I think, that would finally stimulate the United States and other countries to pay much more, the much greater amount of attention than they need to countries all over the world. And remember again that we're way beyond our limit in consumption, and they're way beyond in a whole their limits in availability.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, and actually, so I was thinking when you're presenting your overview, so in the last 60 years, what happened? And I was thinking here about how much we advanced in terms of biodiversity documentation and how much the world advanced in terms of forest destruction. And unfortunately, it seems like the destruction was higher than what we actually advanced in terms of biodiversity documentation. We have
Yep.
We have new technologies now, and do you think there's hope? And what are ways that we might be able to really accelerate biodiversity documentation before all these incredibly diverse forests are gone, so we don't repeat some of that?
It's all relative. The same as goes for individual actions towards conservation. Whatever we do is done and makes things a little better. Whatever we don't do is not done and things go on getting worse. So it's up to us to pick positive routes and take them and learn what we can and apply that knowledge as rapidly as we can. Can we save the world's forests? Not really. Can we save some of them? Possibly, or regrow them or something of that sort. But in order to do so, understanding global ecology, the global atmosphere, the way we all do live together, that will provide the basis for our doing it. I think promoting, I think in the United States, and I keep going back to this, and I would say it must be true in Brazil too, promoting an international viewpoint would be the greatest contribution that we could make. Otherwise, it's simply how much our country can grab or how much we can grab individually to be richer and richer and show that we're going up the tower of wealth. And that doesn't work. Unfortunately, that doesn't work because we're all pulling at the same globe and there's only one of them. And we're responsible for that one. So let's get on with it.
Thank you.
Well, and taking you up on that challenge to get on with it, I think that all of us here can support the idea of providing more opportunities for diverse young people to do science and get a global education in biodiversity and the wonders of nature and the wonders of intercultural exploration. I feel a personal mandate now to go out and create more and more opportunities for young people to do the hard work of saving the planet with the agenda that you've laid out.
Thank you.
I couldn't agree with Beth's sentiments more. I think it really is the generation that we have coming behind us right now that is going to be key. And you've done multiple generations, starting with mine, in terms of educational experience, but there's still a lot of work for all of us to do. And I am hopeful, as you've described it, that they actually do have a different worldview, that they do think about communities in a different way in terms of respect and love. And that as they explore our globe more, as Beth pointed out, and get a greater international experience, which hopefully those of us in the academic community can provide, that they will come to value not just the top 1%ers, but all of us as we work to save this very precious planet. Thank you again, Peter. It was wonderful to hear you talk, and we really appreciate your time.
You're very welcome, and it was a great pleasure to see all of you. All the best. Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.